The steam curled upward like a ghost, rising from a scoop of gravy poured over boiled potatoes. The young Japanese woman stared at it, frozen in disbelief. The guard didn't speak. He simply nodded and moved the ladle to the next tin tray. She had no word for it. The brown liquid, glossy and thick, pooled into the edges of the soft yellow mounds. The smell was rich, earthy, foreign. She hadn't seen meat in weeks, hadn't tasted warmth in months. Her hands shook. This had to be a mistake. In the camps they'd heard stories that the British tortured prisoners, humiliated them, but now she was being handed a hot plate by a quiet man in uniform who offered gravy without cruelty or condescension. Around her, other women whispered. No one moved. Finally, one took a bite, then another. Soon, silence fell, except for the sound of eating. That spoonful wasn't just food. It was the first fracture in everything they'd been taught to believe. The belief that death was preferable to capture had been etched into her bones long before she ever tasted hot potatoes. It had been spoken in the drills, whispered in the mess halls, and thundered through the speeches of her commanding officers. She remembered standing shoulder to shoulder with the others in the training compound outside Osaka, their boots caked with red dust, their backs straight, their eyes fixed forward as the officer barked, "Better to die than bring shame." They had all repeated it back, mouths dry, hearts clenched. It was not a suggestion, it was a sacred truth. To be taken alive by the enemy was to forfeit your name, your family, your place among the honorable dead. It was not a rule, it was a covenant, and like most covenants, it was only tested when it was too late to escape it. She had been a nurse, or rather, trained to be one. Though barely 21, her field experience came fast and brutal. Shattered limbs, maggot-ridden wounds, fevers that burned through bone. In the makeshift hospitals of Rangoon and Mandalay, she had sewn up boys with trembling fingers and watched grown men cry for mothers they hadn't seen in years. But never, not once, had she imagined being on the other side of the stretcher. Yet when the British stormed their final post outside Maitkina, there were no final orders, no glorious last stand. Just confusion. The officers disappeared first, then the radio operators fell silent. Then came the shouting, in English. Boots on gravel. The muzzle of a Lee Enfield rifle. And silence. Not gunshots. Not executions. Just commands in a foreign tongue and hands motioning for them to stand, walk, move. One of the women tried to run. She didn't make it far, but they didn't shoot her. They picked her up, dragged her back, gave her water. That, more than anything, had stunned them. They were supposed to be punished. Instead, they were processed. The march to the camp was long and slow. Their uniforms were soaked through with sweat and blood, their stomachs hollow. They didn't speak, not to each other, not to their captors. They didn't know what to say. Every step into the unknown felt like sinking deeper into dishonor. And when they finally arrived, past the gates, past the guards, into the rows of wooden huts, they saw not the barbed cages they had imagined, but order. Buckets of water lined up against the walls. Blankets folded. Beds, not mats, not dirt. Beds. No one smiled. The guards didn't snarl either. They gave instructions, pointed, led. When the women stripped for delousing, their cheeks burned with shame. But the soap was real, the towels clean, the water warm. They waited for the cruelty to come later. At night, curled into their bunks, the silence was the loudest thing. Some whispered prayers for death. Others simply stared at the ceiling, waiting for it to collapse. One girl counted the knots in the wooden planks above her head. She stopped at 43. That was the number of her brother's regiment. She wondered if he was still alive, if he would know she'd been taken, if he would forgive her. They were prisoners. That much was clear. The wire fences proved it. But the cruelty they had prepared for, the degradation they had been promised, It didn't come. Instead, there was food, small portions, but warm, and not thrown, served, one bowl at a time. Rice, a few boiled vegetables, a weak broth that still tasted better than the muddy rainwater they'd last sipped in retreat. The contradiction was unbearable. How could they reconcile survival with shame? How could they eat and still claim allegiance to the dead? They had been told the British were animals, but the guard who handed her a towel had looked away respectfully as she stepped from the shower. The one who handed her a plate had said, "Please." These were not the monsters they had trained to fear, but that made it worse, because monsters are easier to hate, and hate is easier to carry than gratitude, especially when gratitude tastes like warmth, smells like starch, and arrives in a ladle of something rich and brown over soft yellow potatoes. And yet, even that shocking moment, the gravy, the potatoes, the quiet nod of the British Guard, didn't shatter their fear entirely. Fear, after all, had become a kind of armor. It was easier to believe that this strange civility was a mask than to admit it might be real. The camp they now inhabited was not beautiful, but it was structured. Barbed wire ran neatly along the perimeter, not tangled in malice, but woven in method. The buildings were squat, wood-planked, their roofs sloped against the seasonal rains. Latrines were cleaned, paths swept. Buckets left outside were full of water, not filth. There were no dogs barking, no officers screaming, just a strange, steady quiet. In the mornings, a bell would clang, not the harsh metallic alarm they had expected, but a clean, almost bored chime. The women rose, still uncertain whether this was training or torment. They folded their blankets, stood in line, received their rations. They were assigned tasks, washing, clearing, gardening, mending, and none of it came with a threat. The guards watched but didn't jeer. Their rifles hung on shoulders like reminders, not promises. Then came the tea. It was served mid-morning, usually with a square of bread or a biscuit that crumbled too easily in the hand. The first time, many of the women hesitated. One even knocked the cup from the table, assuming it was some kind of test. But nothing happened. The guard picked it up, muttered something in English, and poured her another. The tea was milky, sweet, and hot. Too hot. It scalded the tongue if you weren't careful. But it tasted like calm. It tasted like peace, and that was the most dangerous flavor of all. They had no word for this rhythm. Captivity was supposed to be pain, atonement, degradation. Instead, it was measured, consistent, quietly indifferent. Each hour passed like the last. Inspections came, but without shouting. Routines were enforced, but without fists. The guards took their duties seriously, but not personally. There was no fire in their eyes, no hatred, just obligation. One woman, Akiko, began noting the timing of the tea bell in her head. She had always been punctual. Before the war, she'd worked in a postal office in Nagasaki. Now she folded her hands at exactly 10 minutes before tea, as though bracing herself. She never spoke during it, but she never missed it either. Another woman, Sumiko, tried to find patterns in the guards' movements. One of them whistled when he walked. Another smoked in the same corner each evening. She watched them not out of fascination, but out of disbelief. She waited for one of them to snap, to break the spell. None did. But beneath the surface of these quiet routines was suspicion. Always suspicion. What was the point of this order? Why were they being treated like people? No one dared say it aloud, but the thought bloomed in stolen glances and tightened jaws. It felt wrong, treacherous. A kindness from the enemy wasn't just confusing, it was corrosive. It wore down their hatred, and hatred had been their compass. Without it, what were they supposed to feel? At night, the women lay awake, wondering when the real punishment would begin. Maybe this was only the opening act, the illusion before the torment. Maybe the tea was a drug, the food laced, the smiles rehearsed. One woman even whispered in the dark that perhaps they were already dead, and this was some twisted afterlife. But day after day passed, and nothing changed. The guards remained polite. The rations came on time. The rain fell, and no one screamed. The world they had braced for, the world of cages and cruelty, never arrived. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a place more insidious, a world where dignity was handed out like sugar cubes in tea, where order replaced brutality, where their silence was no longer resistance, but protection against the unraveling of everything they'd believed. And so, they drank the tea, slowly, carefully, and each sip burned more than the last. Not because of heat, but because of the question it left behind. What if this was real? Then came the potatoes. Boiled, soft, cut into uneven chunks, steaming in the midday haze. One woman thought they looked like clouds resting in a puddle of mud. Another woman squinted as a British corporal approached, ladle in hand. The metal glinted in the sun. He didn't speak. He simply lifted the pot and let the thick brown liquid pour, smooth and slow, over the potatoes on her tin plate. The gravy pooled at the edges, thick with some kind of fat. The smell hit first. Meat, onions, something warm. She blinked. This wasn't rice. This wasn't ration paste. This was rich. She looked at the other women. No one moved. The corporal had moved on. The ladle dipped again. Another plate. Another serving. Another curl of steam. And then someone whispered, "This must be a trick." The words hung in the air, sticky and uncertain. A trick. That made sense. It was easier than believing it was real, easier than admitting that this plate of potatoes with hot gravy, was a gesture of care. One woman gagged when she tried to eat. She bent over her knees, bile rising from her empty stomach, unable to keep the food down. Another took a single bite, then hid the rest beneath her bunk, wrapped in a handkerchief. She could not bring herself to eat, but she could not let it go either. Not yet. The guards didn't react. They served in silence. The food came again the next day. Potatoes, gravy, bread. A piece of boiled cabbage sometimes. Each meal became a battlefield. Not of hunger, but of belief. Their bodies wanted the food. Their training told them to resist. Shame stalked every bite. One girl whispered a prayer before lifting her spoon, unsure if she was asking for forgiveness or permission. Another chewed so slowly it took her half an hour to finish, as though eating lessened the weight of what it meant. Because what it meant was unbearable. To be fed this way, not as enemies but as people, was a violation of everything they had prepared for. The British were supposed to degrade them. Instead, they were giving them hot meals. Balanced, thoughtful, even at times gentle. That kindness didn't feel like mercy. It felt like treason. Their stomachs betrayed them first. After weeks of eating roots and tree bark during the retreat, after stretching single rice balls across whole days, their bodies leapt at the calories. The weight returned slowly. Color flushed back into their cheeks, but every sign of health was a scar to the mind. They stopped making eye contact with each other during meals. They sat quietly, spooning the gravy-soaked potatoes into their mouths with the solemnity of a funeral. The clink of metal against tin became the soundtrack of a slow unraveling. One night, a woman wept silently after dinner. She couldn't say why, not from pain, not from homesickness. She said the food was too warm, that it reminded her of the autumn festivals back home where vendors sold sweet roasted potatoes by the roadside. The smell was almost the same, but now it came from the hand of the enemy. And yet, she ate. Still, the contradictions piled up like trays after meals. A guard smiled one afternoon when a woman shyly asked for more. He didn't laugh. He didn't mock. He simply filled her plate. She bowed slightly, more out of confusion than gratitude. The moment passed like fog, but it lingered. That night, as rain began tapping softly on the roof, she wrote in the back of her worn field manual, "Today, I asked the enemy for more food, and he gave it to me. I do not know how to live with that." No one did, because potatoes weren't supposed to break you. But they did, and every drop of gravy chipped away at a belief system that once felt unshakable, and so they turned to the only outlet they had left: paper. Once a week, the guards handed out sheets, rough-edged, brown-tinged, and stubby pencils worn down from use. "Write home," they said, always in that same detached tone, as if it were normal, as if anything about this life could be considered normal. But what could they say? What could they possibly put into words? Some women wrote dutifully, "I am alive. I am well." Others stared at the page for hours, pencil unmoving, as if to write was to betray something they could no longer name. The words they needed didn't exist. How do you explain that the enemy hands you food gently, that he does not raise his voice, that he says please when offering you a blanket? The things that mattered most were the very things they could not write. Because in the world they had come from, kindness from the enemy was not just a lie, it was a stain. To confess it was to admit that everything they had believed, everything they had fought for, was cracked at its core. Their culture had not prepared them for this contradiction. Bushido spoke of death, honor, suffering. It had no language for mercy, no vocabulary for soft voices or hot gravy, so they lied. Or rather, they omitted. They wrote about the weather, they wrote about their health in clinical terms. "My wound is healing, the doctor comes every other day." They signed their names with precise strokes, folded the letters carefully, and handed them over without emotion. The censors would read them anyway. There was no point pretending otherwise. But the real letters, the true ones, they kept to themselves. Yumi, a former nurse from Osaka, folded a blank page each night and tucked it inside her uniform. She didn't write a single word on it. She didn't need to. The act of folding, of placing it near her chest, became a ritual, as if the silence itself was a message, as if the absence of words could somehow speak louder than the truth. She thought of her mother constantly, of her father's shrine probably gathering dust, of her younger sister who had begged her not to enlist. What would they think, knowing she was alive, well-fed, cared for by British hands? Would they be relieved or ashamed? Would they believe her if she told the truth? The fear wasn't just of judgment, it was of distance, that the people they loved could no longer understand who they had become. The camp grew quieter as the weeks went on, not from lack of noise, but from emotional retreat. The women had no language to share what was happening inside them, not even with each other. The food, the tea, the blankets, they built walls as much as they offered comfort. Each woman was fighting her own invisible war, waged in letters unsent, in words unspoken. When new paper was handed out, the routine repeated. Some wrote lines they would later erase. Others folded their pages immediately, untouched. The guards never asked what was on the paper. Perhaps they didn't want to know. Perhaps they did know and respected the silence. One afternoon, a woman dropped her letter while walking to the collection bin. It fluttered to the ground, open to reveal a single sentence, "I don't know what to tell you anymore." No one picked it up, because that was the truth they all carried. They didn't know what to say. To themselves. To each other. To the ghosts of the people waiting for them back home. They had survived, but in a way that couldn't be explained. In a way that sounded too much like comfort, too much like peace. And in the world they came from, that kind of survival was unforgivable. So they kept writing the weather and folded the rest into silence. She did not write anything at all. Not about the food, not about the guards, and certainly not about the war happening inside her own chest. Instead, she refused to eat. For 5 days, She pushed her tray aside with a firm, trembling hand, her face pale and determined, her lips dry with cracked defiance. Her name was Emiko. She had been a signal operator near Mandalay, trained to decipher and relay orders through gunfire and chaos. Her hands had once moved across dials like a pianist. Now they trembled from exhaustion. But still she held on, not to strength, but to the idea that she didn't deserve comfort, that survival meant something shameful, that eating would be a betrayal. Others watched her but said nothing. Each had their own war. Each woman bore her beliefs like invisible scars, but Emiko's refusal grew louder in the silence. Her bunkmates whispered when she wouldn't wake in the mornings. They eyed the untouched plates returned to the kitchens. One girl offered her tea once. Emiko turned away. In her mind, she was protecting something sacred. By denying herself the food, so warm, so kind, so forbidden, she could stay loyal to those who had died. She had watched a friend leap from a ridge rather than be taken by the British. That friend had not eaten since. Why should she? Hunger became her shield. On the 6th morning, her body gave out. She collapsed in the yard, her knees buckling like paper. There was no sound, just the thud of her frame hitting the dirt. For a second, no one moved. Then a voice shouted in English, urgent but not panicked. The guards carried her into the infirmary, a small wooden hut that smelled of antiseptic and steamed cloth. And then came the thing she feared most, not pain, not force, but kindness. A British nurse, no older than herself, knelt beside her with a shallow bowl of broth. She said nothing. She didn't smile. She just dipped the spoon, blew on it, and brought it to Emiko's lips. Emiko turned her head. The nurse tried again. Her hands were soft, her eyes tired but gentle. The third time Emiko swallowed. The broth was thin, salty. It tasted like weakness, but it warmed her throat, and with that warmth came a new ache, worse than hunger. She wept, though no one touched her. It wasn't the food that shattered her, it was the tenderness. For days, she had imagined the British as shadows with rifles, then as captors with meals. But this was something she had no word for. The nurse wiped her mouth gently and placed a blanket over her legs. Emiko had once learned battlefield triage, when to save, when to let go. This nurse wasn't calculating anything, she was just helping, as if Emiko mattered, as if her life still had weight. That night, Emiko lay staring at the ceiling, the blanket pulled to her chin. Her body ached, but it no longer shook. She could still hear the distant sound of trays clinking in the mess hall. The others were eating again, and tomorrow she might join them. But something had shifted. She no longer felt holy in her suffering. She no longer felt righteous. She only felt human. And that, more than anything, terrified her, because the enemy had not broken her with brutality. They had broken her with broth, with a spoon, with a hand that did not strike, but soothed. And in doing so, they had done the unthinkable. They had made her want to live. And life, as it turned out, didn't wait for permission. It crept in slowly, under doors and through routines, until it was sitting beside them in places they didn't expect. In the second month, the laundry tent became a place where that creeping presence settled in for good. What began as a task, wringing uniforms, folding towels, turned into something else entirely. At first, the assignment felt like punishment. The heavy steam, the stench of wet fabric, the ache in their arms, it was honest labor, not cruelty, but it wore on them. Yet inside that canvas tent, surrounded by buckets of soap-slick water and piles of khaki cloth, the lines between prisoner and captor began to blur. The British uniforms, stripped of bodies, hung on lines like hollow skins. Buttons popped loose. Seams tore. Some of the women mended them by hand. fingers still skilled from civilian lives now long behind them. There was something intimate about the proximity. Not romantic, not even friendly, but undeniably human. They watched the guards hand over shirts, pull off boots caked with mud, complain about blisters or rain. These were not monsters, just tired men in need of clean socks. One afternoon, a sergeant stopped by with a bundle of uniforms and pointed at the gravy stain on one of the tunics. The word rolled off his tongue casually. "Gravy," he repeated. One of the women, Keiko, misunderstood and nodded as if it were her name. He smiled and repeated it slower, enunciating every syllable. "Gravy." She tried to copy him, failed, tried again. "Glebe." The tent erupted in laughter, quick, small, reflexive. For a moment, it echoed too loudly. Everyone fell silent, the air suddenly heavy. No one was sure what to do with the sound. It had come out too easily, like breath after suffocation. Keiko turned red and looked at the floor. The guard coughed, nodded, and walked away. The women returned to their scrubbing, but the spell had broken. Something had shifted. Laughter wasn't supposed to survive here, and yet it did. Not often, not loudly, but sometimes, between chores, it slipped through. Over a ripped sock, over the absurdity of folding British undergarments with military precision, over the way one woman tried to mimic the stiff marching style of the guards behind their backs. They never did it where they could be seen, but even in private, the laughter came with guilt, as if it too was a betrayal. Because to laugh with the enemy, even about something as stupid as gravy, was to admit they were people. It became harder to pretend otherwise. The guards sometimes passed them cigarettes. A corporal once left a bar of soap on a table with no explanation. One even whistled a tune, and when a woman from Fukuoka hummed along under her breath, he didn't stop. He just kept whistling. These were not grand acts of rebellion or friendship. They were small fractures in the wall, and in those fractures the women found themselves caught in contradiction. They still missed home, still dreamed of rice and miso and the voices of parents left behind. But now those dreams sat beside images of boots drying near the stove, the sound of British jokes they didn't understand, and the faint scent of lavender soap that came from the officers' quarters. What began as punishment became routine, and routine, against all odds, became comfort, and comfort was the most dangerous feeling of all, because it meant they had adapted. It meant they could function here. It meant they could fold the enemy's laundry and still sleep at night, even if they woke in the morning with guilt in their throat, even if the laughter still echoed hours after it had died. It was the laughter that made the silence afterward feel heavier. And when the first letters from Japan arrived, the silence became a weight no one could lift. The paper was thin, brittle, stained from the long journey across oceans and senses. The handwriting was shaky, sometimes smudged, but the women tore open the envelopes like they were holding the breath of home itself. And then they read. One woman found out that her village outside Hiroshima had been firebombed in the spring. Nothing was left. Her father's name was listed in the local death scrolls. Her brother was missing, likely killed in a last stand near Saipan. Her mother had not written at all. The letter had come from a distant cousin. Another woman read a short message from her older sister. "We thought you were dead. Mother died before we knew otherwise." The paper trembled in her hands. It was not the news that broke them. It was the timing. Too late, always too late. They had clung to the hope that someone, somewhere, was waiting, that their suffering would be redeemed by reunion. But what they read in those letters was ruin. The homes they dreamed of no longer existed. The streets they knew had become ash. Their families had moved on or vanished altogether. And as they sat in that British-run camp, fed 3 times a day, clothed in clean uniforms, wrapped in blankets handed to them by foreign hands, they realized that their own country had no idea, or perhaps no interest in what had become of them. That night the camp felt frozen. Even the wind moved cautiously. Grief turned inward. Loud sobbing gave way to quiet withdrawal. Meals were eaten in silence, eyes stayed on the ground. The camp still functioned, bells rang, tea boiled, but the women moved like ghosts. They were grieving not just the people they had lost, but the illusion that home would somehow save them. It was the British guards who kept the routine going. One offered a girl a second helping of potatoes without being asked. Another left a clean handkerchief folded on the laundry bench. They said little. Maybe they didn't know what was in those letters. Maybe they did. And still, the food came. Still, the water ran warm in the showers. Still, the beds were made. The women sat with this contradiction like a stone in their throats. Their homeland had taught them that the British were barbarians, but it was the British who handed them soap and stitched their wounds. It was the British who called them by name and gave them grief's quiet dignity. There was no malice in the guards' faces, no triumph, just tired professionalism, and now and then a glimmer of something gentler. One corporal paused at the laundry tent and asked, in halting Japanese, if anyone had received good news. No one answered. He nodded, as if understanding that silence better than any reply. Keiko, the woman who had once mispronounced gravy and made the tent laugh, folded her letter into a square and placed it inside her shirt. At least I got to read her name again, she whispered later, her voice like cracked porcelain. Yumi, who hadn't received any letter at all, stared at the women who had. Even grief is a privilege now, she said, and that was the hardest truth, that in captivity they were living better than many of their families now could, that the same empire that had demanded their sacrifice had not even bothered to check if they still breathed. So they held their letters carefully, as if they might disintegrate. Not from age, but from the unbearable weight of being remembered too late. The rain began in the afternoon, soft at first, like a whisper drumming on the rooftops. By evening, it had become a roar, a monsoon. Sheets of water spilled from the sky, seeping under doors, flooding paths, pooling in corners of the camp where the ground had sunken with time. By nightfall, the bunks near the perimeter were soaked. Water rose ankle-deep in some of the huts. Women huddled on the higher beds, knees pulled to their chests, shivering not just from cold, but from memory. Floods had followed them through the jungles of Burma, through marches without end. But back then, water meant disease. It meant misery, exposure, and rot. It meant surrendering to the elements and waiting for fever to carry you off. Now it surrounded them again. Yet something was different. A corporal came in, boots splashing through the growing tide. He said nothing, no orders, no shouts. Just a quick glance around the hut, then he left. Moments later he returned, arms stacked with blankets. Dry ones, woolen, folded, still warm from storage. He placed one at the foot of each bunk, didn't speak, didn't linger. The silence in that moment was louder than 100 commands. One woman stared at the gift in disbelief. Another reached out, touched the fabric with hesitant fingers, then drew it to her chest as if it were gold. The texture was rough, coarse, but not harsh. It held heat. It held care. A voice broke the quiet. Soft, raspy. It smells like firewood. Heads turned. It was Sayaka, the woman who had once wept over gravy. She clutched the blanket against her face, breathing deeply. I used to help my father carry logs, she said, as if speaking to no one in particular. Smells like our house in winter. No one answered. But the air shifted. Because that was the first time someone had said it out loud. I no longer fear them. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't proud. It was a truth whispered into the folds of a woolen square. The blanket, simple as it was, held a weight that uniforms and guns never could. It was warmth offered without expectation, a gesture of shelter in a world still uncertain, and it wasn't the only one. Earlier that week, a guard had handed out extra tea when the temperature dropped, not because he was told to, just because he noticed. Another time, a prisoner had tripped carrying laundry, and the sergeant helped her up, not with impatience, but with a hand that lingered just long enough to steady her. None of these acts were grand, but they added up: blankets, tea, a steady hand. These were the bricks in a new kind of foundation, one not built on surrender, but on humanity. The women didn't trust easily. They couldn't afford to. But fear, like hunger, has a limit. Eventually, it empties, and in its place, something else must come. That night, as rain pounded the roof and water lapped at the bunk legs, they pulled the blankets tight and listened, not for threats, but for the sound of each other breathing. No one spoke of bushido anymore. No one whispered about dying with honor. Now they whispered about dry socks, about whether the tea would be served late tomorrow. It was not weakness. It was not betrayal. It was survival, reshaped, and it came not through force, but through consistency, not through domination, but through decency. The storm outside raged on, but inside, under those blankets, something quiet had begun to settle. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the memory of warmth, real, human, and undeserved. As you listen to this moment, this spoonful of quiet rebellion, we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if these human stories matter to you, help us share more. Tap the subscribe button right beneath this video, and don't forget to click the notification bell right next to it. With your support, we can keep bringing forgotten stories like this one to light. That memory lingered long after the storm passed, long after the blankets had been folded and returned, long after the paths had dried and the routines resumed. Then one morning, without ceremony, everything changed. A British officer arrived with a clipboard and a solemn face. His boots were muddy, but he paused at the edge of the mess hall, cleared his throat, and said it. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. No cheers followed. No cries of joy. The women sat frozen, spoons halfway to mouth, tea cooling in tin cups. For a moment, the only sound was the wind slipping through the wooden slats of the walls. One woman put her spoon down and closed her eyes. Another covered her face with her hands and began to weep, not from grief, not from relief, but from something else entirely. The slow unraveling of everything they thought they had survived for, because survival had always meant return. And now return meant stepping back into a world that had no idea where they'd been, no idea what they'd tasted, what they'd shared, what they'd lost and gained. The war's end didn't feel like freedom. It felt like paralysis. They were no longer prisoners, but they didn't feel free. They had been fed by the hands of the enemy, sheltered by their roofs, called by their names, laughed with them, cried near them, changed beside them. Now they were supposed to leave. Go home. Rejoin the world that had left them for dead. A world where mercy from the British was unthinkable, where honor was measured by how little of yourself you let the enemy touch. And yet, the enemy had touched them in ways no one could see. A bar of soap, a folded blanket, a bowl of gravy. Sayaka, the one who had once whispered that she no longer feared them, took out her journal and wrote, "I've tasted the enemy's kindness. How do I explain that?" There was no answer, no way to write it without sounding broken. Some of the women tried to rehearse the story they would tell, how they endured, how they resisted, how they kept their distance. But none of it rang true. The truth was messier. The truth involved silence and warmth, tea and tears, guilt and gratitude knotted into one. Yumi said nothing for 2 days. Then she asked a question out loud that no one answered. What if survival changed us too much? No one slept well that week. They walked slower. They stared longer. Not at the guards, but at each other. Because only they would understand. Only they knew what it meant to be fed with care by the people they were told to hate. Only they knew what it cost to accept warmth when you were trained to expect cold. The British never gloated. There were no banners, no songs, just the quiet turning of gears as the camp began to prepare for repatriation. Uniforms were sorted, names were recorded. One corporal, the one who had once handed out blankets during the flood, tipped his hat when he passed a group of women gathering their things. No one returned the gesture, but no one turned away either. And in that silence, a kind of understanding passed between them. The war was over. But the questions were just beginning. How do you return home with memories you cannot speak of? How do you explain being protected by those who were meant to destroy you? How do you live with the comfort you were never supposed to receive, let alone want? And perhaps hardest of all, how do you look at your own people and admit that the enemy made you feel human again? Years later, she lived near Hiroshima, a quiet neighborhood tucked between the sea and the hills. She married a school teacher, raised 2 sons and a daughter, and kept a garden lined with herbs and spring onions. Her neighbors knew her as polite, reserved, dependable. She volunteered at the temple during Obon and rarely missed morning prayers. No one asked about the war, and she never offered stories. But on certain days, especially during the rainy season, she would boil potatoes. Not as her mother had done, not in soy and sugar, but simply with a bit of miso thinned in broth. She would sit at the low table, turn her face slightly away, and eat them in silence. Slowly, reverently. Her children never understood the ritual. It didn't match any festival or tradition. It was hers alone. One evening, her daughter, now in junior high, asked why. You always make them the same way, just potatoes and that miso. Is it from Grandma? For a moment, the woman didn't respond. Then she placed her chopsticks down and looked at the bowl with something between sorrow and gratitude. I once had something like this, in a place I never expected to live, she said, her voice distant but steady. Her daughter blinked, unsure what that meant. But the woman did not explain further. She didn't need to. That bowl of potatoes was not about taste. It was not nostalgia. It was memory. Boiled down, quiet, undeniable. It was a spoonful of something she had received during a time when she thought she no longer deserved kindness, when the world had collapsed and nothing made sense. A spoonful that made her cry, not because it was good, but because it proved she still had the capacity to feel. Food has a way of holding memory without judgment. That simple bowl of potatoes carried more than hunger. It carried her shame, her confusion, her reckoning. It reminded her of how she had wanted to die and how instead someone had handed her a tray and said nothing. It reminded her that she had lived and that somehow she had rebuilt a life. She never told her husband the full story, not because she was hiding it, but because there were no words that could capture it properly. He knew she had been a nurse. He knew she had been taken prisoner, but he never knew about the blankets, or the tea, or the gravy. He never asked why she folded her clothes so precisely, or why she sometimes paused at the laundry line and stared at the uniforms in the wind. But he once said, while watching her eat those potatoes, "You seem far away when you make that dish." She nodded and simply replied, "Far, but still here." That was enough. Her children grew, married, had children of their own. The world changed. The city rebuilt itself from ash. And yet, once or twice a year, she would still prepare that same meal. Her grandchildren would wrinkle their noses and ask for curry instead. She would smile, serve them what they liked, and later, when the house was quiet, return to her bowl. There was no guilt left, only a strange sort of dignity, a quiet understanding that survival had not ruined her, but remade her, that those months in a British camp had given her something she could never explain. Compassion where there should have been hatred, warmth where there should have been fire, and always in the center of it, a potato. Soft, steaming, with a sauce that was not quite gravy, not quite miso, but something in between. Something she had claimed as hers. Something she never forgot.